Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Dr. Melik Khoury, president of Unity College. Dr. Khoury has a long and distinguished career in higher education, including positions that include CFO, CAO/Provost, SVP for External Affairs, SVP for Strategic Positioning, CMO, Enrollment. Well, there isn't a heck of a lot that he hasn't done in higher ed. But what truly distinguishes Dr. Khoury are his unique skills that enable him to guide institutions through times of disruption. He specializes in working with tuition-driven colleges, helping them become viable in the 21st century while providing them with innovative, sustainable plans that allow for their long-term economic stability and growth. And trust me, Dr. Khoury knows what he's doing. Over the past year, Unity has transformed its business and governance models, enabling it to more than double its enrollment, make rapid changes that reflect its operating environment, and provide lifelong learning opportunities for its student and alumni. Melik, welcome to the show.
Pleasure to be here.
You guys are doing some really new stuff at Unity. About a year ago, you announced you're moving over to a new model of 8 terms per year instead of the traditional 2-semester model. And what you've done with that, jumping from 800 to 1,800 FTEs in a year, is remarkable. How did you get to your position here at Unity? And because you obviously know how to, and I hate to use the term, but I'm going to, you know how to think outside the box. So your experience, how did that lead you to get to where you are and come up with these ideas?
Sure. I was one of those students who was a non-traditional student, if you will, who was lucky enough to get an opportunity to get higher learning. And for me, I reflected on my own experiences and realized just how lucky and in some ways privileged I was to have been given that opportunity. And as I looked at what is happening with higher education over the last 25 years, it became evident that since the Higher Education Act of 1965, which was supposed to democratize higher education, we really haven't moved the needle with graduation rates, affordability, flexibility. And then you add to the fact that with the advent of technology and the realization that climate change and the environment is not a political issue, but a real one, I really needed to understand why, for an industry like higher ed that claims to be all about students, why so many were not successful and why so little had real access. And really, it became a concept of reverse engineering using my education, my experience, talking to people a lot smarter than me, and really starting to put the problem ahead of the tradition. And that's kind of what started this process. And I was lucky enough to have worked in almost every department in higher ed. So I got to see how the engine is run. In some ways, I've been lucky. In some ways, I've been in the right place at the right time. But most of it is talking to people smarter than me, trying to learn the actual core issue that is stopping success, and beginning to understand just how different higher education is from type of college to type of college, and how sometimes we all try to run like we're the same business model and we're not.
Well, you're absolutely right on that. There should be multiple business models in higher ed, and everyone tries. It's like I get this image of a very tight shoe with the shoehorn, and something hurts when you try and put that foot in the shoe.
Yes. I mean, if you think about it, when we decided to democratize higher education, the only model that existed was the elite one, right? The institutions that were fully funded by religions, endowments, government. And we decided to mass produce that and not change the model. And then as a country, couldn't fund it appropriately. And we are wondering why so many colleges are in turmoil, even the ones that aren't at risk of closing, because the entire governance structure, the entire approach was designed as if we were the only keepers of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And that somehow, when students didn't have to take out loans or families did not have to take big risks to support their students, it was a different proposition. And since that proposition changed, many colleges are struggling to make the shift. Sometimes I use the example of storytelling, that over the last few centuries, stories haven't changed. But there was a time you could only hear that story around the campfire, then the town crier, then print, and now you can stream. But the stories don't change, just the medium. And I think transforming the medium with which we can support students in a very high-paced world, in an ever-adaptive world, we need to change, we need to adapt, and we need to stop looking as if any sort of break from tradition is heresy.
I agree with you 100%. These changes, many of the changes are being driven by the change in environment. I mean, the outside environment in higher ed or anywhere is changing far more rapidly than it ever did, technology especially.
Oh, yes. I mean, for the longest time, we in higher education have truly been the great white shark. We've never had to evolve. And we have never been trained to change. We have been trained to protect.
Yes.
And so in many ways, it is not institutions' faults that they can change. The systems were designed to make sure the status quo doesn't change.
Mm-hmm.
And so it is sometimes easy when you read the higher education information out there, it's easy to blame faculty, it's easy to blame staff, it's easy to blame administrators. But in reality, we are all trying to work with a system that was never designed for the 21st century. And so in some way, each and every one of those constituencies is doing the right thing, but the system isn't designed to make changes to be more adaptable.
Most definitely. I mean, if you really, from a change management perspective, forget about mental models, because we all know that mental models can be the most difficult things to change. But if you really want to institute change and make it stick, you've got to change underlying structures and the processes to get changes of output. One of the big changes, or one of the big problems right now, educational equity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think that's the part where maybe I differ a lot from my peers. A lot of institutions, especially small private, view equity as the lucky few who get that big scholarship,
Mm-hmm.
right? The 10 full rides for the underrepresented student. And I'm trying to figure out how to create a scalable model where any student who wants and deserves an education is not at the mercy of a college willing to give an endowed scholarship. And so I think the concept of equity transcends even more than just affordability. It also transcends culture. If we are truly going to support a changing demographic in this country and globally, we need to stop saying that the only true education is one that allows a student to take time off from their family and spend 4 years in isolation with some internships and then go back out into the real world. We need to shorten the time between the student's ability to earn a living and continuous improvement and long-term learning for them to get the cultural competency, to get the career readiness skill, but also be a civic-minded, well-rounded human being. I don't think any of us would argue that those are key points, but I think that over time, society has created a false dichotomy that you're either learned or you're career ready. And we need to get back to it is theory and application combined that makes an employee a citizen, a constituent, ready to face what is the 21st century, where technology, global unrest, a pandemic, climate change are all issues that are so complex that are we really going to take a break from it for 4 to 8 years before we engage with it? That's what we are trying to solve.
Mm-hmm. And I think your point is, in many respects, goes to the need for lifelong learning, because things change so much and so quickly. I don't care whether you're in academe, whether you're at the top of the business world, or if you're out there working in construction. The technology changes so quickly that you need to go back and learn new skills.
Absolutely. And you can't always quit your job and go to the mountaintop to learn it.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I sometimes get criticized about is when I start having these conversations, they always think it's an or. It's not an or.
Mm-mm.
We should provide the very different approaches, but we should be able to allow students to choose their path and not be prescriptive, if you will, on creating value of one approach of teaching someone over another.
Yeah, and you have done that very well with your CBUs.
Yes. I mean, what we found out at Unity College is that we went through a multi-year process of trying to understand our mission and our curriculum. And what we realized is our mission as America's Environmental College was very relevant. However, access to this curriculum was really restricted to traditional students who were looking for a residential model. We also understood that in order to serve a different audience, adults, different kinds of degrees and the like, trying to serve all of those students in this model was a fool's errand.
Mm-hmm.
And taking a group of people who are experts in one way and telling them in addition to that, they also have to change their pedagogy and their technology was also not very fair. So we created the enterprise model where we determined a series of functions within the institutions that are centralized: technology, human resources, branding, etc. And then allowed each and every one of our sustainable educational business units to really focus on a specific type of students. Our strategic plan, for example, is very simple. You identify the audience, you figure out the program that they need, you figure out the modality that you're going to use to support them, be it face-to-face, residential, synchronous, asynchronous, etc. Then you build it, and you build it for that audience. And what the CBU model has allowed us to do is separate by student type, by client type. And so the faculty members, the staff members, the curriculum designers, the instructional designers, the advising model is different from each and every one because they're supporting different students and they don't have to compromise to satisfy each other. And so that has allowed us to move faster while having an institutional guardrails to make sure that efficiencies and effectiveness are in place where they need not be so different.
Now, wait a minute. I'm getting a little confused here. It sounds like you've actually done market research to find out what students need.
Yes, I mean, I know that sounds really interesting. Yes, and we found out that in order for us to be successful, it was not about adding more majors. It's about changing the schedule, the pedagogy, the tuition model, the level of support, the kind of experience that each population needs. And some populations don't care about. And becoming a student first, we call it audience first, because we don't only serve students anymore, we also serve clients, as we have our own, as one of our sustainable educational business units has a lodge and a farm and an event center for folks looking for an eco-friendly environmental experience.
It sounds very similar to what Michael Crow is doing out there at Arizona State, is looking at lifelong learning and bringing people in to get them the needed skills where they are in their career.
Absolutely. I mean, ASU, of course, is at a much larger scale for now, but
I like that.
For example, the Sustainable Education Business Units, our latest one is called the Technical Institute for Environmental Professions. That one, we only offer associate degrees, certificates, and micro-credentials.
Mm-hmm.
Our tuition model is very, very different. The modality that we are using for that is high-flex classrooms, because they tend to be people who are not looking for a baccalaureate degree. Sometimes are just looking for a skill. Mm-hmm. And then we have our distance education, CBU. And that supports our place-bound, primarily adult students looking for asynchronous baccalaureate and master's program in the environmental careers.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have what we are calling hybrid, which is our high residency program that is more of the residential for those 17 to 22-year-old traditional freshmen and transfer.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have sustainable ventures. We offer our business programs and our actual revenue generating manifestations of our curriculum, which is actual businesses trying to debunk this idea of those who can't do teach, and to show future business entrepreneurs of the world that you can run a sustainable and ethical business while learning. And that's more of a low residency program. And each and every one of those has their own faculty, their own handbooks, their own staff, their own tuition, their own calendars. And it's allowing a level of flexibility to support that kind of student, while the enterprise ensures brand equity, accreditation, kind of support services and leadership and the like. And that model has allowed us to pivot so that when folks in one CBU are really busy, we're not asking them to also do something else. And faculty and staff over the years have been able to self-select and go into different CBUs.
Mm-hmm.
Most of our CBUs have actually been created because the faculty and staff in one CBU have an interest that in order to implement it in that place would have created way too much disruption. And so instead, I don't believe in pilot programs much, because the problem with pilot programs is once it's successful, you're pushing it back into the model it couldn't live in. And so by creating the CBU model, once it's successful on its own P&L and its own students and its own support, it never has to be integrated back into the very environment it couldn't survive in to begin with.
Sure. So your pilots are essentially the startup phase for a, quote, new business model. And if it's successful, you drive it forward. And if it isn't, you kill it off.
Yes. We like to give our investments up to 3 years to break even, unless it is supported by a major grant or donor. And then the employees, for the most part, are able to then jump to other CBUs if that doesn't survive.
Mm-hmm. So what you've done, and I'm looking at this from a change management perspective, you've changed the underlying structure of how things will work. You've changed the processes within those structures. You've changed roles within those structures. You've changed tuition models within each of those CBUs, those sustainable education business units. So you've changed a whole lot of things, but you're not forcing one model into another. You're allowing them to stand alone and thrive where they are.
Yes. And that also has, changed the mindset of these sustainable educational business units to understand the value of investment, because sometimes in higher education, again, I would always exclude the highly subsidized and the largely endowed. But for those of us who are tuition driven, we many a times despise the revenue generators. And so by allowing each group to really measure its own investment and revenue and expenses as its own independent P&L, we're able to really hone in on not having too many loss leaders and really generating the kind of revenue to adequately support our students. And that it's really changed the culture from one of, I would say, diplomacy to a meritocracy.
Okay.
We've gone from committees to task forces. We've gone from rights of veto to engagement and executive decision-making at all levels. So we've really gone from running as a democracy to living in a democracy and running like in a meritocracy, looking at performance-based. So for example, our deans, they engage faculty and staff on a project, they solicit feedback, but then they have to make decisions. And in this industry, that is not commonplace for many. And so we had to invest a lot in training and support of management, because most of us in higher ed don't have that training. And teaching the concept of consistency, constitution, in order to lead, in order to manage, instead of constantly hiding behind the votes didn't come in, was such a foundational shift that some of my faculty and staff enjoyed jumping out into a new CBU where they got to create their own model in lieu of the one that existed, for generations.
Mm-hmm. Do you have plans for new models?
Yes, absolutely. One of the things I love about our CBU model is each one really experiments with a different pedagogy, with a different audience. Like I said, one is asynchronous online, one is high residency with remote options, one is synchronous high flex, one is an apprenticeship through a business model. There will be more, but I think also what we are hoping as part of our enterprise model, I've just created a new position as the president of the Unity College Enterprise, and she is in charge of all of our centralized functions. So as a private affiliation, the future for us is not just building our own CBUs, but outsourcing some of our expertise to colleges who might not have or even some businesses who might not have the infrastructure or the bandwidth or the technology to build it themselves or the time. I mean, for us, we were lucky. If we actually started this process during the pandemic, we would probably be closed. We started this process 5 years ago. We just accelerated it during the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it makes perfect sense when I take a look at a TCS education system who runs all of the back ends for 5 or 6 different colleges, and those colleges, universities, they do their own marketing and they do their own delivery of education. You're talking about forming that same sort of thing for your own CBUs and other folks as well.
Absolutely. I would say the fundamental difference, I think, between us and TCM, apart from size, of course, because we just started, is that we are also very careful that our CBUs serve different audiences.
Yes.
There is internal competition is not necessary. And so, and I think our version of what is centralized versus what is decentralized is a little bit different, but the concept is the same. What we've built is an organizational structure that is our own internal private affiliation system.
Yes.
Each CBU has its own lead. All the faculty and staff report to that lead, not to the president or to the CAO or to the enrollment manager as with traditional institutions.
In many respects, it's very much like a corporate model with business units.
Yes. I think what's really fascinating is that almost every college in the country is a corporation.
Oh, yeah.
I just laugh about how much people try to hide that fact. When the corporation itself is just a legal entity, it's our interpretation of it. And so, yes, we are a 501c3 with limited liability companies as CBUs, governed by one board, one CEO, with an enterprise that supports and CBUs allowed to really lean into the audience that they're trying to serve, be it a traditional student or a working adult or somebody looking to buy produce in our farm.
It has me really curious. NECHI is your accreditor. Yeah. How do they find this?
NECHI has been very supportive. One thing I respect about NECHI is they don't like to be surprised. What they want to make sure is that we have the right controls in place. So, for example, the president of the enterprise also has the moniker of Chief Academic Officer. And so even though the faculty report to different VPs, the controls, the assessment, the accreditor is centralized.
Okay.
So we are our own internal auditors for our CBUs. And we, registrar is centralized. Now, every CBU might use its own software, its own calendar, which can be a nightmare for the centralized functions.
Yeah, really.
Which is almost the opposite of what other colleges are doing, which is they're all becoming one. I am trying to create 1,000 life rafts instead of one Titanic. And
nice metaphor.
Thank you. We have the appropriate assessments and controls in place because we're still one organization. So, for example, all the CBUs have to push any new curriculum changes through the enterprise so that the enterprise can make sure that there's no duplication, that we are meeting the Carnegie classifications and all of the elements for controls. But there are many institutions like Harvard, for example. I mean, their school of law and their business school and their liberal arts schools, all of their faculty and staff don't report into one giant community. They're an independent group.
Yeah.
So we're still one institution, but there could be a time when we could accredit one of our CBUs in a different location. What if we opened a center or an institution in California. That would require a substantive change, of course, but then we would manage multiple accreditations.
Sure. That makes perfect sense. Now, we've alluded a little bit with governance changes that have happened, and especially giving much more decision-making to deans and taking them away from committees. I imagine this has sped up the process significantly.
Absolutely. We have designed a matrix organization, if you want to use a technical term. You talk about change management. We call them task forces instead of committees. The only difference is we've taken the political nature and social capital as the currency for change.
Okay.
Because I don't know about your experience, but I remember back in the day, if you wanted to get something passed, we are using student dollars and taxpayer money to spend days politicking office to office to get the vote to pass. Are you familiar with that?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's so funny that Netflix just launched an entire series basically mocking our institution. It's called The Chair.
Yes, I'm going to watch that one.
And don't get me wrong, that model is very important if you are sitting on a hedge fund and you want to make sure that those funds are stewarded appropriately. But if you are a revenue generating institution with a changing demographic and you want to adapt, somebody has to be able to make a decision. And somebody has to be able to account for that, to be accountable for that decision. So one of the things that we did at Unity is that we looked from the board to the president, to the vice presidents, to the deans, to the chief officers, to the directors, and we created what we call, it's not a novel concept, role, scope, and authority. So we know the decisions that people make. And so then when we create a new project, something new, that person has a goal and an authority, and their job is to bring in the different constituents to work on that problem, to give them advice, but then ultimately they have to make a decision. Because one of the things I used to hear a lot is what poor communicators administrators are. And the reality is some are, some aren't, but it's that the system was never designed to allow them to make change. Their system was designed to convince people to vote for change. And that is well and good when demand exceeded supply. So for us, the role, scope, and authority really pushed us towards performance-based meritocracy instead of a process-based democracy. And one of the things that I say a lot that is sometimes unpopular is I want to live in a democracy, but I want to work in a meritocracy. And so that's and that has sped it up. And I have employees from other institutions who love this, who are jumping ship to come here. And I've got folks who think that this is really not how higher education is supposed to be, and they're jumping ship and going elsewhere. And that's okay. We still do live in a free market.
And I think that's a good thing. Now, you have gotten some incredible results so far in a year. I mentioned earlier, your enrollment has jumped from 800 to 1,800 FTEs. But there's some other benefits as well for doing this kind of change for an institution. Can you run through some of the things you've seen, please?
Absolutely. So, you talk about the 800 to 1,800. Yes, I mean, that number is great. And right now we are positioned, if nothing changes, to be about 2,500 students by next June. But what is better than the numbers is the story behind it. We are seeing more and more people who would never have dreamt in their lives that at a private, not-for-profit, environmental, career-driven degree or certificate could be something that they could attain unless they were able to take out really, really big loans or put their lives on hold or go to a major university like Stanford or ASU. So what we've seen is our average age go from a 50-year average of about 19 to an 18-month shift to about 30 and growing.
Wow.
We have seen a 50-year diversity self-disclosed always between 8 and 10% to in the last 18 months going to 20 and growing. We have seen our ability to serve single-digit military vets to now having almost 10% of our institution and growing being military vets who really care about the environment and want these science-based careers. So adults, minorities, folks who've always seen the environmental sciences as an elite niche program designed for those with trust funds, that it's really the green career. I've had a number of students talk to me over the last year alone how as juniors or as sophomores, they are getting employed full time, and they don't have to choose between their education with us and taking that job, because with our calendar, they're able to still come and do a face-to-face course if they need it, but really go remote and really take advantage of the flexibility within our modalities that we offer for the different outcomes that they need. So you're looking at demographic changes. So we are beginning to look like America. And in the climate century, which is what I like to call the 21st century, where the issues of unprecedented issues with geopolitics and weather and food and energy, to be able to graduate more from the walks of life, people with our degrees who are culturally competent, who understand the value of the environment, who understand the concept of sustainability, and are also career ready in the sciences, and don't only have to do that in a 4-year residential model. And these young women and men getting jobs in their junior year and don't have to drop out because they have to support their family is the true fulfillment of this vision that Unity College is moving towards.
That's incredible. That is incredible. As much as I hate to do it, we're coming up to the end of our time because I have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation. You're doing something very special here, Melik. You really are. So 3 takeaways for presidents and boards on how they can change their business model to improve enrollment and grow like you have.
Sure. I think number one, you need to, as a board, are you an institution that is driven by philanthropy, by tuition, or are you subsidized? Understand which of those is your primary lens, and then assess your documentation from bylaws to policy and see if some of your processes actually work in opposition to your goal. That I think is what we did, and we recently won the Nason Award from the Association of Governing Boards for just doing that.
Nice.
I think number 2, if you are a president, you have to be brave. And you have to create a system in which you are not operating out of fear. And you need to stop looking at yourself as a political figure, but as a steward for the students in which families are entrusting their hard-earned dollars for you to support. Many institutions say they are student-centric, but check your processes. Many institutions are more administration-centric, faculty-centric, board-centric, alumni-centric. Are you truly student-centric? And the third is never put tradition ahead of innovation. If you are not investing in failure, then all you are doing is incrementally saving your way into oblivion. The world has changed. Technology is the new facilities. That's my advice, is that you've got to, I was quoted in university business quoting an old 90s band that I'm a big fan of, free your mind, and the rest will follow. We have an obligation to graduate the future generations, because if we do not become more relevant to employers and students, we are going to lose more than our schools. We're going to lose our civilization.
Thank you. Excellent, excellent suggestions. So what's next for you, Melik? What's next for Unity?
For Unity College, I believe we have a lot of audiences that we have not yet been able to serve appropriately. So we will be creating a little bit more research and development of how can we continue to bring tuition down? How can we be more scalable to support audiences that can't even afford what we have now? What is the role of virtual reality and augmented reality within the fabric of the institution and our curriculum to have students ready for the 21st century workforce? I'm not talking about majors, I'm talking built in. And how do we as an institution go from serving students only to becoming the institution that becomes the placeholder or the ground zero for the transformation that is needed to ensure an educated world without it having to be so darn expensive?
Great, great. Well, I look forward to following your journey on this. I think you're doing some amazing stuff there, and please keep up this excellent work. Thanks for being a guest, and I look forward to the next time we get a chance to chat.
Thank you, sir. Much appreciated.
Thanks for listening, and a special thank you to today's special guest, Dr. Melik Khoury, president of Unity College, and for his sharing how Unity has more than doubled their enrollment through doing excellent market research and transforming the higher education business model. Our next guests are Dr. Michael Polyakov and Armand Alekbey from the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. They will be joining us to talk about their recently released report, The Cost of Excess: Why Colleges and Universities Must Control Runaway Spending. It promises to be a great episode.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.